Replace your print servers with a secure cloud solution that scales with you. You'll automate print management, get scalability and flexibility, as well as complete control with visibility into all your print processes. Start a free 30-day trial by going to printerlogic.com/packet pushers.
Hello, I'm Johna Johnson, CEO of Nemertes, and I am here with my co-host, who today is Jerry Murphy, who is the SVP of Research and Consulting at Nemertes. Welcome, Jerry.
Guten Morgen.
Okay. You are listening to Heavy Strategy, which is the show that tries to ask the right questions, not give the right answers. And on today's show, Jerry and I are going to be talking about a topic that is near and dear to our hearts ever since we worked together in the 1990s, advising large enterprises on technology and technology strategies. And the topic is this: the top mistakes people make when developing or executing a technology strategy. Take it away, Jerry.
Well, I'd say the first thing I would come up with is do not assume, or people assuming everything will go according to plan. Because in all my years of coming up with strategies, implementing strategies, something always comes up. I don't want to say goes wrong, but that too. But to assume that you are such a good planner and you've covered every single base that when you go to implement a strategy, it is going to work is pretty naive. I think things are always more complex than you think. And to assume that you've covered every base is to think more of yourself than you should.
I could not agree more, Jerry, and I will just highlight something. For those of us listeners who have been members of various militaries, Jerry is a former Army officer. And what's that saying? No battle plan survives the first encounter with the enemy?
Something like that, yes.
Exactly. And I forget who said it, but that is we could say no technology strategy survives the first encounter with the real world is probably the way to put it.
That's good. Yeah.
And Jerry, I know this is going a little bit down a rat hole, but in your experience, what's the best way to mitigate against the, I would say, risk, but virtual certainty that a technology strategy isn't going to go to plan? Like, what do you do about that? Knowing it's not going to go to plan, what do you do to make that less painful?
There's two things. One word, the most important word is communicate. We do too much assuming that, one, everybody's going to be in alignment with my phenomenal idea. Two, that they're going to know everything I'm talking about. And three, that they're going to be available with time, with resources, and with money to support me in my plan. So very often when I see strategies and plans being made, you don't include enough people, right? It's like you have the big wig who's saying, here's what my overall strategy is. And then you've got some mid-level people that are like, okay, here's how we're going to implement that. But the problem is with any strategy, we don't include upfront everybody that's going to be impacted by my strategy. And inevitably, when that happens, you're going to find out things are not as you assume they're going to be, or people are not as supportive as you think they're going to be, et cetera. So we don't.
Or there's another issue that you didn't think of that has an impact on what you're doing.
Exactly. And so we don't usually include everybody that needs to be included up front soon enough. We're not communicating what people, and then so what happens is by the time people who are going to be impacted find out, you get the steamroll effect where something's going to break something. Whether it's you're breaking somebody's feelings or you're physically breaking a system or you're lacking integration from something or you're creating a security gap, that's the thing is we never include enough people. And inevitably that means that when I go through implementing my strategy, there are going to be effects that I hadn't considered that are going to come and bite me that I have to deal with.
Well, and I know, Jerry, you said there were two things, and the first was communicate. I want to give you time to get to the second, but I also want to weigh in on that communicate because my thoughts drift as you're talking to Greg. And for those of you listeners who remember Greg talking about this same issue, 99 times out of 100, the reason they bring in consultants is to ensure that communication happens. Because what happens is if you're supposed to hold a meeting and invite everybody who needs to be there, and you forget all the right people, or the other thing that happens is you invited them, but they don't want to come because you're just some IT wonk and they don't really care. Well, now the company's paying big bucks to a consultant, and you better get your rear end in that chair in that meeting. And so a lot of time, we as consultants, our job is to make sure that everybody who needs to be is in the room, and that their input is solicited, and that their feedback is solicited, and also to call them on it when that doesn't happen. I remember not terribly long ago presenting a strategy to the CIO that ultimately saved him $50 million. And in that room, we were supposed to have cybersecurity as part of the development of the strategy, which took us about 3 months because it was a very large organization. And in that room, it was literally the boardroom, the board table, the CIO, the CISO, and we laid out the strategy that had been nominally agreed on by everyone that participated. As good consultants, we made sure that security was in the room the entire time we were developing the strategy. We presented one aspect that had to do with cybersecurity, and the CISO goes, "Hold on, we're not doing that." And literally the CIO turned to him and said, "Well, that's a problem then, because your guys were in the room for the past 3 months and not one of them raised your objection. That's on you." And we did get it resolved. And ultimately, we did do it the way the CISO wanted it done because he had a valid point. But the point is, you can't then blame the consultant or blame the strategy developers if you were in the room and didn't weigh in. So that communication, enforcing it, I would just reinforce.
And my second point, which is the corollary to communication, right?
Right.
Communication is you have to tell people. This is the corollary, that is the people have to be there to tell, right? So it's getting enough people involved soon enough is the second part, right? It's like you got to be sharing with people, and then it's all of the people that need to be involved. So when you think about, I'm going to roll out some new initiative, that's going to be some new application I'm going to be rolling out. The people who are using the application, right, the end user, right, if this is some application that my business people are using, right, it's like they're going to be consulted, because it's like this has to fulfill some requirements, right? It's got to do so many transactions, and it's got to have a certain look and feel for the person using the system. So they get the input. And if you're smart and you're thinking ahead of time, you're going to go, oh, and it's going to have to do so many transactions per second, which means I need such a big a database so that I can figure out how to size the system. And if I'm thinking, then I go, oh, and this has to maybe integrate with some other systems that are part of my architecture, But what is often forgotten are things like, did you get the requirements for the people who maintain the system? What are their requirements for how is it I'm going to back up the database? How am I going to recover the database? What is my mechanism for upgrading software changes? How about the people who are managing your network and managing security? How do I get the alerts from the system failing into those systems? How do I make sure I get antivirus stuff on here for the security people? Did I think about what the power and cooling requirements are that are going to be incrementally impacting this on the data center, right? So it's all those other things I'm putting in are going to impact the entire environment. And very often we're not thinking about not just the easyability use for the person who's using the application, but the easyability use for the person who's maintaining the system, the person who's doing trouble tickets, customer service support. How is it that they're going to get information about how to use this system? We usually only think about those things as they're being implemented, and then somebody raises their hand and says, "What the heck is this thing? What is this new database I have to back up? What is this new application that has a new IP address that's not part of my whitelist, so it's not going to get through my firewall, et cetera, et cetera."
Well, and I would say we're getting a little down into the weeds of execution versus strategy, but I still think it comes back to, if you know that's going to be a problem, you might as well get that input early on in the strategic development. The challenge with that, Jerry, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on how to address it. The problem with that is, we'll sit here as consultants and say, you should get feedback from everyone in your organization. Well, okay, fine. But what that actually means is you've got some, junior sysadmin or some junior contact center person sitting in on some meeting that might have 40 or 50 people on it on a Zoom call or a Teams call, in their already packed day wondering, what the hell am I going to do? What the hell am I doing here? There's all these acronyms I don't even understand. How do you balance that with getting the right input from the right people at the right times? Because sometimes that person really needs to be there and you really needs to weigh in with input we don't even know to solicit. So it's not like we can sort of structure a form and ask people to just pipe up when they need to. How do you balance that?
Well, I think it's unrealistic to say I'm going to have everybody that needs to be involved at every meeting all the time. That becomes counterproductive because you're right. It's going to be a waste of time to take some busy operational person and have them at every single meeting. But you need to make sure that there is time in your plan to solicit input. And especially if somebody's a junior person, they don't understand all that strategy. A good consultant is going to think about when's the right time to ask this person? What are the right kinds of questions to ask this person to lower their fear barrier to be able to, solicit that kind of input?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I will say there's a cadence to holding the planning meetings, holding the working sessions, and holding the outbriefs. And what I mean by that is and we're talking about a large organization here, but you can scale it down to a smaller one very easily. In a large organization, there's kind of the control channel for generating the strategy, which sounds very meta, but it's very necessary. It's the thing that says, okay, first we're going to do A, B, and C in the process of developing the strategy. And that includes who you invite, when you invite, what kinds of meetings you have. And then typically you have a sequence of working sessions where you hammer out the things that you need to nail down, such as, I keep coming back to cloud because it's such an essential strategic decision. What are we going to put in cloud? When, where, why, and when and where and why are we going to change that decision of what moves to cloud? The answers to those questions are probably 20 hours of team meetings in your organization. Right. And then what I would move on to is there are a series of outbrief meetings. And this is the kicker. When you talk about big mistakes, another big mistake is that people are terrified to show the sausage being made. So people think that the process of developing a strategy is, I'm going to lock myself in a room with a bunch of smart people. We're going to pop out 10 days later with your newly minted strategy and share it with the masses. Couldn't be further from the truth. What you want to do is hammer out a couple basic principles, turn those into some concrete impacts they might have on stakeholders, and then share them with the stakeholders with the mindset of, this is what we're currently thinking, nothing set in stone. How would you feel if we took your giant cloud application and brought it back on-prem? What would upset you about that? What would make you happy about that, or whatever? And the reason most IT people don't want to do that is because the fear that the stakeholders will yell at them. And you know what? They will. Suck it up. Yep. Put on your big boy, big girl, big whatever panties and deal with it.
Yeah. And don't take it personally either. I mean,
exactly.
People are, it's at the end of the day, you're doing something that's a job for a company, and you can be, passionate about it. You can be 100% committed. But when people get frustrated, they're frustrated at a project, not you as a person. So a lot of times when these things happen, you're going to have bugs, you're going to have pushback, but you just can't take those criticisms and comments personally. You got to realize it's just a job. We're here ultimately performing this function. But, if you take it too personally, that because we're doing this pivot and we're making this strategic change, that now we're doing it differently. Anytime you change, that something's going to be different. And people viscerally don't like different, right? Many people, when you eschew change, right? And so when you change it, it's like, I don't like that because it's unknown, right? People fear the unknown. And whenever I make a modification, implementation, I'm going to be doing something different. And the different may be phenomenal, but until it's proven to be phenomenal, I fear it, right? So that's
exactly. Although I will say, to a certain extent, you should take it personally. Actually, it may not be personal. It may not be a value of you as a human being, but you may have made enemies in the organization, and the enemies may take the opportunity to shoot you down. And as Greg would put it, that's what they pay you for. If you're developing a strategy, it's not just your technical expertise. It's not just your institutional knowledge. It's also the fact that developing a strategy is wrangling a herd of cats or whatever they call it. A group of cats that are cranky and fussy and will hiss at you and bite you and scratch you. And it's hazardous duty pay, and you should be getting that. So your reputation may, take some hits. You're putting yourself at risk, which is another reason a lot of people don't want to do a strategy, because if it doesn't get followed or if people argue with it, then that person loses, political juju, and you don't want to do that. But basically get paid for it. I mean, make sure that you're not just sitting there where, you're the IT guy or gal, and suddenly somebody says, "Oh, I need a strategy." And you're like, "Okay, I'll do that, but don't pay me extra or anything, because it's not like it's hard." No, it is hard, and you should get paid extra. If you're in the position, if you're CTO, if you're an architect, if you're a strategist, that's not a low-level job. And I would say that would also be another big mistake I've seen. A very large organization I worked with went from one extreme to the other, which is they took their top architects and said, "Build us a strategy." And the top architects went in the room and they came back with a deck that had 200 pages and was full of 6 to 8 point font and dense with wires, and nobody could make heads or tails of it. But it was a really pretty picture, and it had logos and stuff and everything. And they said, "Well, wait, we can't actually decide what this means. Like, we can't use this to make decisions because nobody except the authors know what it means. And they're very, very smart men and women, but we don't understand it." So then they swung all the way to the other direction. And the CIO at the time said, "Well, we are bringing in strategy people." And I worked with some of these strategy people. And I will say they're smart people. I'm not going to name the companies that they came from. They're very well known. These people may have had some relationship to a technical background, but they came dancing in with their, consultancy charts that had arrows and bubbles and explosions and all sorts of cool things. And they condescended to all of us very nicely, but they never did actually explain, like, "Hey, should we build another data center, turn to colo or turn to cloud?" And even more importantly than the answer to those questions is, based on what decision points are we going to make those decisions? So essentially, I would just let me wrap up, Jerry, and I know you got something to weigh in on, but I would say one challenge is having the most technical people on your team create a strategy, and then you can never figure out what it was they said. The other is to hire a professional, full-on strategist who doesn't understand technology to come in, and that's not going to help you either. And Jerry, you were going to say something.
Streamline your IT infrastructure by switching to a cloud-native print solution. You'll reduce infrastructure by eliminating print servers, get front-end and back-end print management. You'll be bridging the gap between automation, document management, and print. You'll secure your data end-to-end with native integrations and enjoy a zero-trust-enabled environment. Start a free 30-day trial by going to printerlogic.com/packetpushers. Oh, it also integrates easily with EMR and ERP solutions. Plus, a simplified scanning solution is included. You can automate capabilities, create no-code forms and workflows in the same admin account, have full visibility, and reduce print tickets by 90%. Start that free 30-day trial by going to printerlogic.com/packetpushers.
Well, there's 2 points I want to make. One is context is important, right? So I've said this often is, like, if you have a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. So depending on who you ask to develop a strategy, anybody is going to give you a strategy from their own context, right? So a security person is going to give you a security strategy. A networking person is going to give you a networking strategy. A data center person is going to give you a data center strategy. The CEO is going to give you the overall company strategy. So I would say it's important to be very clear as to what the context is of the strategy when you're giving people a mandate for developing one. The second thing I would say, especially with respect to your concept of bringing in these smart genius people to come in with, "I know everything and I'm going to do it." The problem with "I know everything and I can tell you the right way to do it" is those things tend to reek of pedagogy and not reality. And that is,
Yes.
They're going to come in with a whiteboard that literally has nothing on it and said, if nothing were to exist and if you had never built anything and you were going to do it right from the very beginning, here's what you should do, and they can build this beautiful thing that's all integrated and makes complete sense. The problem is that thing needs to be implemented in the real world. So you say, what's the right way to, build a data center, right? Well, if you've never built one, I build a certain way. The problem is if you're going to add some new capabilities, but you already have one existing, then you're either going to throw away what you've already done, which 99.9% of the people are not going to do, or you say, here's my goal, here's my context, here's my strategy, but I've got to throw that strategy in the context of what already exists. So the challenge is not just what is the strategy, but how do I implement that strategy from where I am now? And that's the part very often these high-powered consultants say, they'll wave their hands and say, oh, the implementation is an exercise. Don't bore me with the implementation details. I came up with this big idea. It's up to you to figure out how to implement that in your current environment. And that's a very naive thing to think about, because that's very often where these things fall apart. Is it conceptually it's great, but have I thought about the culture of the institution with which that strategy is going to implement it? Have I thought about how it is I'm going to transform what is there to that thing? And those are not trivial activities at all, either one of them.
Well, and that's great that you mentioned it, Jerry. And when you mentioned that whole, that I can't say the word, pedagogical thinking, it made me think of a project you and I were both on about, a couple of weeks ago. It was a strategic alignment exercise where the goal was, this was an organization where each sub-organization, like security, infrastructure, its applications, was actually quite good at developing its own strategy, but they never talked. And so the strategies were always in conflict. And so one of the leaders of the architecture team, we had recommended as part of this exercise that they develop a technology architecture. And the leader sort of stood up and said to the group, well, we disagree with that recommendation because what we actually need is a business architecture, a technology architecture specific to a particular area. And what we need to do is get an architecture that for the technology that underlies all the business. So we let him say that. We agreed with the goal. And later on, I just leaned over and whispered to him, hey, you're not wrong. Here's the problem, though. When we say technology architecture, we actually mean exactly what you just said. And the people that talk about and have developed business architectures and written books about them almost always take an application-centric view of the world. So they're talking databases and servers. Actually, not even servers, databases and applications. They never get down into the infrastructure. And our concern is that the infrastructure gets included in the technology architecture, and that's what we mean by it. It includes applications and infrastructure. And what was funny was the next time the guy got up and presented the strategy, he used our term. Not that it's the right term, just he agreed with our criticism of the pedagogical, I said I can never say that word, pedagogical definition of architecture. And that's really kind of the key point.
Yeah.
Test everything. Yeah, go ahead, Jerry.
But here's the other thing we did that I think was kind of mind-blowing to them, and it was really interesting to watch, right? We sat there as this company was developing their strategies, right? We would have one department say, here's the requirements for my strategy. My strategy needs to have these following capabilities, these following qualities, right? And then the other departments would then, as an exercise, say, based on those requirements, from my perspective, I'm going to tell you what I think your strategy should be. So it's very illuminating to have other departments come up with a different department strategy, giving that department strategy requirements. And they ended up coming up with some very incredible ideas that, one, the department who needed to come up with strategy hadn't even thought about, but two, as you put each department's strategies together, it's amazing how suddenly there was these links of cohesion between the departments that hadn't previously existed because they'd all thought about it within their own little siloed environment. When you started to force them to think about things from the other person's perspective, suddenly every strategy had a cross-departmental cohesion that never existed before.
And I think that's actually an excellent point, Jerry, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think we're talking around, as we are wont to do here in Heavy Strategy, we're talking around the fundamental issue, which is, strategy needs to be by definition, broad, inclusive, contextual, all those things. You need to avoid developing it in a silo. And remember that a silo can be anything from IT versus the rest of the organization to, the CTO versus the rest of IT. The more points of view that are looked at in the development of the strategy, the more effective the strategy is going to be. Now, the flip side is you're probably listening to this going, Johna, for heaven's sakes, that's great, but we could spend the next 10 years soliciting everybody's input, listening to points of view, and never generating a strategy, which is true, which is why you kind of need that control channel for the project of generating a strategy that has at least a nominal beginning, middle, and end. And I think that actually brings me to another mistake that I've seen, which is you can develop the most perfect strategy in the world with all the right input, touching on all the right emerging technology, focusing on the business requirements, everything. And if you put it on the shelf and then just keep doing what you were doing, why did you bother? You should have sent everybody to the beach for that, 120 hours or whatever it was it took you, everyone individually, to come up with this.
Yeah. I was going to say it slightly differently.
Yeah.
I was going to say, and it's a similar mistake. Maybe it's a variation on what you're saying, but I find that perfection is the enemy of good enough, right? Because if you try to make something, quote, perfect, so we're saying you need to be inclusive and cover everything. But if I try to make it perfect and cover every single base to the nth degree, it'll take infinite time. I'll never get it done. And by the time I finally get it, my business will have changed and what I designed and articulated won't be applicable anymore. So I think sometimes while we do need to have cooperation, you got to get all the different viewpoints. Sometimes I think, getting something that's, 80% of the way there and 20% of the time, and then you make modifications as you go through the implementation, sometimes actually can be better than trying to make it perfect, because it never will be perfect.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Perfection, the perfect is always the enemy of the good. And I would also say, and, as I was thinking about, as we were preparing for this podcast, one of the things that I kept thinking about the fact of how do you use a strategy? And I know in previous episodes, we've talked about what the strategic outputs should be. And for example, you use a strategy to help you set selection criteria when you're picking a product, because you want to buy a product that aligns with your strategy, meaning it comes from a vendor who is aligned with your strategy and it has the feature functionality and capabilities that align with your strategy. You also use it to set things like org and ops and processes and policies. If your strategy is, XYZ, you want to make sure that all those policies and processes and everything else are aligned with it. But really, I think the big thing about a strategy that kind of kicked in while I was working out this morning is the strategy is that vision that everybody on the team that's charged with implementing it needs to be kind of holding out. And at every moment of every day or work day, you should be looking at that strategy and saying, is what I'm doing here aligning with that strategy, helping us achieve the vision that we've painted in that strategy? If it's not, and it usually isn't, because what happens is we take this process. If it's not, you need to change it. But let me talk about why it might not be. Usually what we do is we do this very kind of cut and dried. We develop a strategy, we launch a bunch of projects, we generate project plans, and then we focus all of our time and attention on the project plans. The project plan says, I need to lift weights this morning. The project plan says I need to do whatever. And we get so focused on achieving the project plan that we lose sight of the strategy that the project plan is in the service of. And so what you want to constantly be doing is asking yourself, getting back to the battle plan, surviving the encounter with the enemy, like, okay, I know I'm moving this project forward, but is this project still moving the strategy forward? or have things changed? And obviously, you don't want to just sort of abandon a project plan halfway through because your idea is, oh, we can meet this strategy better by, charging up this mountain over here. But you do want to constantly be asking yourself, is what I'm doing right now in the highest and best service of the strategy? And if not, how do I revisit it so that I can make it that way? And that's a hard thing to do because it's much easier to simply check the check boxes. And a lot of us are happier. We get that little endorphin rush from, I said I was going to do this thing today and I did it today, but did it really serve the purpose?
Yep. And here's a corollary to that, which I think is equally important. It's another big problem we have, right? One of the things that happens when we're implementing a strategy is, and you mentioned, you think about vision, you think about things like focus. Another word for that might be priority, right? If I'm going to put my focus and my attention and my vision on this new thing, right? This new strategy, a corollary to that means I'm not focusing on something I used to focus on. So in other words, if I'm saying with this strategy, I'm going to emphasize and there's going to be this priority on this thing, then that means something else that used to be a priority is no longer a priority. And so as we change with some strategy, right, there's going to be something that we used to do that was important that now is being superseded by something else that's more important. So you have either one or two things that happens. Either the person continues to do this less important thing, so we're not aligning with the strategy, or management says, oh, they're both, oh, yeah. We want to focus on this new thing, but don't lose the focus on that other thing. In which case I call BS, right? Because you can't have, I have this new thing that's a priority, but yeah, those other three things are also equally priorities. Well, you can only have one priority, number one important thing. Anything else as important as this has got to be number two. And so if we're going to create a strategy and say there's this focus on this new vision, recognize there's going to be something else that used to be the vision that isn't anymore. And we got to be very conscious about letting people know that this other thing, that thing that used to be a priority, isn't anymore. And it's very tough for everybody to realize that. And that oftentimes is a big problem.
Well, and I know we're getting close to the wrap up, but the way I've found in the past to address that one head on, because obviously you can't, it's one thing for you or me to call BS on management, Jerry. First of all, we're old and crusty enough that we don't really care anymore. And second of all, we're usually in the role of consultants. So we're getting paid no matter what. We can say whatever we want to say. But if you're in the organization, you're at the beginning or middle of your career, you probably really can't call BS on management. But what you can do is typically what happens in those working sessions of developing a strategy, somebody says, well, we should do X. And somebody else says, well, we can't because it's so much work. Well, the right answer to that is, let's talk about how much work it is. Can we kind of figure out, roughly speaking, how much work it is? And then in the working session, okay, guys, if it takes an additional month of work a year, since we can't create more time in a year and we're not going to be hiring, we need to raise the point of what is it we're not going to be doing for a full month a year or whatever it is, not going to be doing to do that, and then get buy-in by management at the event and make a note of it. So that when management is sitting there, we say, hey, boss, this is what we've decided we want to do. And that means we are not doing this thing. You good with that? Because speak now or forever hold your peace. And what happens is if the boss speaks, then you get it in writing. And then the next time the boss says, oh, but I need you to do this thing, you say, well, that goes counter to what you said on Thursday, August 8th or whatever day it was. This is, it doesn't always work. If your boss is just impossible, it's not going to work. But if your boss is a reasonable person that sometimes overextends, which I think would describe me more than Jerry, but both of us to a certain extent, I'm always happy to hear when an employee or a colleague says, I can't do X because there's not enough hours in the day. I have top 3 priorities. Which one goes to number 4? I am happy to help them figure out which one it is to maximize their effort. So yeah, I think that's an excellent point and something to focus on. And Jerry, before we wrap up, anything else you'd like to add in the top mistakes you've seen in developing a strategy?
That I'm just funny. You're pressuring me now, and I'm just actually drawing a complete blank. I was actually just thinking about the last thing you were talking about, and I was just thinking. You had said earlier in one of our examples, like you put up the strategy, and a security person says, "No, you can't do that," and it always bugs me when I hear that, right? Because a security person's job isn't to say you can't do that. A security person's job is to say, what is the risk of doing that, right? So if you're going to say, for example, my strategy is to be more intimate with my customers, I may want to have more channels of engagement. And the security person is going to say, oh, you can't put that on your cell phone because their cell phone, we don't have antivirus things on people's cell phones, and that might be a vector for things coming in. So to me, the answer isn't if I'm going to be more intimate, I can't be because there's these other channels on secure. The security person's job is to say, oh, if you're going to have more channels to be more intimate, recognize there's these risks to doing that. And it's my job to tell you what are the risks, what are the costs of mitigating those risks. And then you sit there and say, oh, is the risks of this strategy for intimacy worth the cost I'm going to play on those? So very often, anybody in any domain, in security I picked because that's one that sticks out. It's obvious for people. It's a change in something is going to create problems for people, but that doesn't mean you don't do strategy. But it's up to management to understand what those issues are, such that you can make important decisions for how you prioritize your money, your time, and your risk. So people have to let people know what their objections are, but that doesn't mean you don't do something, but you have to bring it to management to let them know about these things such that they can be taken into consideration and priorities can be created. And when people don't tell people, that's when the problems happen.
Yep. And I think on that note, you've actually picked a great topic for a future heavy strategy. We can talk about security, cybersecurity, and the role of strategy. I know you said it's not explicitly just them, but it's a big enough group that we really need to talk about that separately. And with that, that's all the time we have. So thank you guys for joining us today. If you've got feedback, a follow-up, a suggestion on what we should cover, please send us a message at packetpushers.net/FU. And y'all know FU stands for follow-up. We'd love to hear from you about your own experiences and opinions, and we love to get ideas from listeners. Also at packetpushers.net, you'll find the Network Break podcast, which helps you stay current on the latest tech news and what it means. Very relevant as you grapple with issues of IT strategy. And there's a whole lot more other tech and networking podcasts, some new ones coming up, our newsletters, a job board, all sorts of fun stuff. And if you want to talk to us at Nemertes, please hit us up at nemertes.com. That is N like Nancy, E-M like Mary, E-R like Richard, T like Thomas, E-S like Sam, nemertes.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks, and hear you next time.
Talk to you later.